Okay, so we are live and open. So let's start from the remark from our department head today, Prof. Sadam, please. Sorry, I think he's muted.
Terima kasih Pak Dede. And good afternoon and welcome Prof. Martin Hilpert and the participants in the virtual room of 7 sharing session on linguistics. Today, 24th November 2020. Thank you very much to Professor Martin Hilpert for setting aside your time for us and ready to share your expertise and the result of your research. Dear participant, the topic that will be discussed today is short and sweet, what we can learn from 2,400 English clipping. This is a very good opportunity for all of us here who handle the English morphology course in your institution to get 2,400 English clipping that have been recorded by native speakers. For us, it will take time for a non-native to get that much usage. Yeah, so we have to read a lot of books in order to be able to get 2,400 clips. While we are teaching our subject in morphology, English morphology, we are able only to give maximum 10 example, 10 to 50 or so it's hard to find because we have to read a lot of text in order to be able to get such 2,400. Okay, to keep time, I invite Professor Martin to start the presentation for 60 minutes, and it will be proceeded with 30-minute discussion session. Well, Prof. Martin, time is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think I will start sharing my screen, if that's all right with you. Okay, so I hope you can hear me all right. G, does the sound okay?
Yep, sounds good, Martin.
Okay, and the slide you can see too?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, very good. Well, then let me thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today, even if we have to meet digitally, it would be much nicer in person. But I'm happy to see you all. And yes, I'm glad to share with you this research that I've been doing together with two of my colleagues, David Kreuer Saavedra and Jennifer Rains. They've been working with me on a joint research project, and the findings that I'll present to you today, I wouldn't have been able to get to those results all alone. So you've already read the title. Let me explain what this is all about. It's about short words in English. They're called clippings. And the good thing about clipping is that I don't have to do a lot of explaining. Yeah? You all know what it is. It's exemplified by English words such as prof or gator or fridge, which are shortened versions of longer words to which they correspond. In these cases, the longer words are professor, alligator, and refrigerator. And just by looking at these parts that are marked up in red here on this slide, you see that clipping can work in very different ways. So in the clipping prof, it's the final part of the long word that is clipped off. And in the clipping gator, the initial part of the long word is missing. And in fridge, well, that's a case what you could call front and end clipping. So there are parts missing from the beginning and from the end. So just from looking at these three examples, it seems like clipping is a very unconstrained process. It seems that anything works. And well, this of course raises a number of questions. Well, how does clipping work exactly? Yeah, and just to illustrate my reasoning process and the kinds of questions that I want to ask in this talk, I'd like to start with this question here. So, can we explain when and why speakers clip off different word parts? Are there factors? Are there explanations that allow us to make an educated guess about that kind of process, or is everything really purely accidental? So ultimately, what David, Jennifer, and I want to find out is what goes on in speakers' minds when they create clippings or when they decide to adopt a clipping that they hear in the speech of others. Yeah? So let me try and make this a little bit more concrete. So on the next slides, I will need your help because we're going to carry out a few scientific experiments. Yeah? And the question is the same in all cases, namely it is, which clipping variant do you prefer? Yeah. So on the next slides, you will see a long source word and then two alternative clippings. And your task is to select the clipping that you prefer. Yeah. Let's pretend that this is a forced choice. So you have two alternatives and you have to pick one. You cannot propose alternatives. Yeah. And I would ask you to write your preferred alternative into the chat. I'll try and monitor the chat to see what's going on. If you're ready, I suggest that we get started. So here's the first example. The long word is navigator, someone on a ship who is responsible for navigation. And if you want to give that person a short nickname, what would you call them? Yeah, would it be hey Nav, what's going on? Or would it be hey Navic, what's going on? Feel free to put things into the chat, and I see there are things coming in. And so far we seem to be pretty in agreement that nav is the preferred option. Yeah, so there's a clear majority for the short variant nav. That's very interesting. Let's take a second example and see how things are going for that one. So here we have the word municipal, which is an adjective that means at the level of the city administration. So there can be municipal regulation, municipal services, and so on and so forth. And if you want to shorten the adjective, we could, would you prefer mu or muni? And again, yeah, it looks like I have only responses for muni, which is again interesting because it means that it's not always the shorter variant that wins. Yeah, so with nav versus navic, navic wasn't all that popular. So one hypothesis for that could have been that speakers always go for the shorter variant, but here that doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah, you pick muni rather than mu. Let's look at a third example. So sometimes there are clipping variants that are equally long. So this is what we have in this example here. The word is renovation, and the two clippings are reno and renov. So let's imagine that you bought an old apartment and you're asking friends if they can come over on the weekend to help you with reno or renov. Okay, I see a large majority for renov. Do you get any takers for reno? Apparently not. Okay, that's fine. So in a nutshell, what I want to do in this talk, I'll come back to these polling results here. I will start with a few general observations about clipping and about the ways in which previous work has addressed it. What is it that we currently know about clipping and about how it works? And then in the second part of this talk, I want to present the English clipping database that David, Jennifer, and I have been putting together. And as you saw in the title, we have more than 2,000 of them that we collected from various sources and that we then annotated sorry, for variables that we believe to be decisive for the way in which speakers create new clippings. I'll give you an overview of the elements that are represented in the database and then also of the annotations that we have used to describe those elements. In the third part, the empirical part of this talk, we will explore the database with a statistical technique that is called Configural Frequency Analysis. And I will explain what this method does and what insights it can give us. And then we'll look at some of the results and we'll come back to the three polls that we just did. So, well, the basic idea here is that given that clipping has been presented as such an unsystematic process, the three polls that we did here were actually fairly fairly clear with regard to the decisions that you took. And so that must mean that there are certain tendencies with regard to how clippings are formed. Okay, so at the end of the talk, I will present some conclusions and I'll also point to future work that we still have ahead of us in the clipping project. And if that works for you, I'm going to get started with the first part. So how does clipping work? And here, I'm afraid I have to start with what appears to be a little bit of bad news. If you look at introductory textbooks on English linguistics or English morphology, more often than not, what you read is that there is nothing particular to see with regard to clipping and that you should move on to more interesting, more systematic topics. The wide variety of clippings, so front clipping, middle clipping, end clipping, and so on and so forth, that has led some researchers to conclude that there are really no systematic patterns at all. For example, Laurie Bauer states that there is no way to predict how much of a word will be clipped off in clipping, nor even which end of the word will be clipped off. So fairly pessimistic. And Jan Don, in a more recent textbook on English morphology, states that clippings can result from deletion of just any part of the word, and there doesn't seem to be a clear pattern. Okay, so I'm not giving away too much at this point if I tell you that our results contradict these statements. So yes, there is a lot of variety in how clippings are formed, and no model will predict with 100% certainty how a given source word will be clipped. But there are clear tendencies that can be shown to be real and statistically significant when we look systematically at quantitative data. So I should perhaps also point out that in other areas of linguistic variation, we really never have 100% certainty, but we can nonetheless approach the spontaneous, natural behavior of speakers by looking at probabilistic tendencies in large amounts of data. Okay, now up to this point, there hasn't been a whole lot of research that has approached clipping in this quantitative way. And in fact, Sabine Antlappe, who has worked on clippings and shortened names, has expressed this in a recent paper where she calls for studies that try to build predictive models of how clipping works. Yeah? So she says, a general problem in assessing the predictability of output structures of truncatory processes, those are shortening processes. So a problem in assessing what will come out of word shortening is that in much of the pertinent literature, the degree of predictability is not in the focus of investigation. So the studies haven't really tried to come up with predictions that tell us, okay, if we have this kind of source word, that is going to be a likely outcome of the clipping process. Yeah. So the work that I'm going to present to you today tries to go into that direction, and it tries to lay bare some of the more predictable aspects of the clipping process. Let me briefly present to you another aspect of clipping that has not received a very satisfying answer up to this point. Namely, that issue concerns the semantic relation between the clipping and its source words. So here we find different views that are actually mutually conflicting. For example, Haspelmatt and Sims hold that clippings don't differ semantically from their source words. And this is certainly true for many clippings, including, for example, photo. Yeah, is that any different from photography or photograph? It's probably the same. Yeah, there's memo and memorandum, which semantically seems to do the same job. However, there are also other examples, and one view with regard to those examples has been expressed by Ingo Plak, who argues that clippings convey effective meaning. So they express familiarity with the denotation of the derivative. So one example of that would be lab for laboratory. Yeah. So if I tell my colleague that I'm going to the lab, that conveys that she and I are familiar with that place and we have mutually shared knowledge of it. So this is signaled by the short form lab. And again, there are many more examples that are in line with this view. However, there are further semantic relations that are really not discussed very often. And some of those examples I've given you at the bottom of this slide here. For example, bro comes from brother, but it has developed semantically into a term of endearment rather than a kinship term. And then we have con, which comes from confidence trick, but it's more than that. It's more than a confidence trick. It is a kind of crime that involves deception and planning and all that. Yeah, so it has a meaning of its own, I would say. And then merch, well, a kind of merchandise, but a special kind of merchandise, the kind that, for example, bands bring to their concerts, like T-shirts and badges and records and CDs and stuff like that. Okay, now more recently, the question how speakers choose to use end clipping or front clipping has been addressed on the basis of empirical data and with quantitative methods. So one such analysis has been carried out by Thomas Berg, who has analyzed a database of more than 900 clippings that comprise both proper nouns and names. And he finds certain tendencies here. Namely, for example, a difference with regard to nouns and names is that front clipping is almost never found with names. Yeah, so front clipping, things like gator, for example, from alligator, we do see that, at least some of the time with nouns, but with names, it seems to be quite rare. So Beth from Elizabeth is actually an exception. Yeah? Most name clippings keep the initial part of the name. So Ben from Benjamin, or Jenny from Jennifer, and things like that. Right. Another tendency is that front clipping is more typical with source words that have non-initial stress. Speakers try to maintain stressed syllables when they create clippings, and they try to avoid processes that delete stressed material. With regard to the length of source words, there's another insight that Thomas Beck finds, namely that front clipping becomes increasingly unlikely with longer source words. And finally, he also finds that the effect of length is not the same for nouns and for names. And this is quite interesting because it means that the factors that have an impact on clipping, they do not simply add up, but instead they interact with each other. So if you have two factors coming in, the outcome is not the sum total of each factor on its own. So this means that if we want to analyze this, we have to use multifactorial statistical methods that can actually model the interaction of variables. I'll say more about this and explain what that means. Right. Now, in terms of what exactly drives the process of clipping, Sabine Antlappe has formulated a hypothesis that we adopted for our own work. Specifically, she argues that clipping is driven by cognitive factors, by pragmatic factors, and by phonological motivations. So, in other words, there are functional explanations for why clipping works in the way it does, because it has to work in actual communicative situations. So, a crucial issue in this regard is what Antlappe calls recoverability. So the clipping has to be recognizable as the short version of a longer source word. Yeah? If I use a short word and you cannot figure out what it means, what longer words it belongs to, then the communicative project has failed, so to speak. This means that the safe choice for the speaker would actually simply be to use the whole source word and not clip at all. But on the other hand, there's also a motivation to make the clipping as short as possible. And that would be the principle of least effort. Yeah? So the speaker wants to use as little energy as possible. And that recoverability and the principle of least effort are conflicting forces. They're competing motivation, and they balance each other out. Sabine Antlappe further notices a number of tendencies that characterize clipping and that strike this balance between recoverability and the principle of least effort. For example, many clippings tend to retain and to keep the first syllable of the source word. And in English, the first syllable is really a robust cue for recoverability. Yeah? If the first syllable is not retained, then there's at least a good chance that the main stressed syllable of the source word is retained, because stressed syllables also guarantee good recoverability. In the empirical analyses that I'm going to present to you, I'll come back to these guiding principles. But for now, let me just tie this up and let me formulate the research questions that guide the project that David, Jennifer, and I have been working on. So first of all, we wanted to know whether English clippings follow predictable tendencies and what those are. Yeah. So what patterns do we find in the empirical data? Second, can we model and can we capture those tendencies by a probabilistic model that uses statistical techniques? And then third, can the features of the model, the generalizations that come out of it, can we explain those functionally in terms of interacting factors that pertain to cognition, to discourse pragmatics, and to phonological motivations? Right. So this, as a general framework, I hope to have given you a rough introduction to clippings and what characterizes them. If we want to know more about clipping, then we absolutely need a solid empirical basis to go on. And that's what I want to talk about now, the clipping database. So over the past months, David, Jennifer, and I have been compiling a large database of English clippings. And this process has been a little special for me because, well, I'm actually trained as a corpus linguist. I'm used to working with corpora. And when you're interested in things like syntactic constructions, then it's quite easy to just formulate a search pattern and retrieve relevant examples more or less automatically, and that's your data. Yeah. With clippings, it's not that easy. There's no easy way to automatize the search. So you could either read through lots of material, that's one way, or you could try to exploit several resources that already present clipped words as such. And that's what we did. So, for example, we went to the Oxford English Dictionary, which has a number of entries that are described as shortened forms. So we harvested all those. On Wikipedia, there are several edited lists of clipped words. So that gave us another set of examples. You may know the Urban Dictionary, which is a cool website with neologisms, new words, and many of those are in fact clippings. And then we further came across published sources such as Fabrice Antoine's English-French Dictionary of Clipped Words. And of course, any research article on clippings that we came across, we searched for examples that we didn't have already and included them in the database. And on top of all that, we also recruited ordinary speakers of English who filled out an online survey for us, in which they provided us with clipped words that they would use in their everyday conversations. So I'd like to point out that we looked at all of these entries very critically, and we did not take everything. So we did a bit of sifting. And in contrast to work by Thomas Berg and Sabina Antlappe, we decided not to include shortened names like Danny or Beth or Bill. We also didn't include acronyms or initialisms like, for example, SETI or NAFTA or IT. We wanted to concentrate on the process by which words are shortened, that is, material is taken away, and the remaining material is still close in pronunciation to parts of the source word. We further didn't accept any clippings that were augmented in some form. So for example, the word hobby, short from husband, has at the same time a diminutive suffix E that is not present in husband itself in the source word. Now, that's not to say that this is not interesting. It's an interesting pattern. It corresponds very closely to patterns that Antlappe has observed with proper names, such as Billy and Johnny and Danny. But we decided to keep the focus on nouns, verbs, adjectives, and other parts of speech. Right. And then finally, we did not include truncated phrases, such as, for example, ab-fab, that stands for absolutely fabulous. Son of a, I'll let you figure out. I'm sure you can do the math. And well, all of these we did not include in the database, just to be transparent. I'll be happy to go more into the reasons why we made these decisions in the way that we did. I just wanted to present this here so that you have an idea of what is in our database and what is not. Right, with all that in mind, let's take a look at the data itself. Here you see a graph that shows our clippings according to the number of syllables from short to long. And it's in fact easy to see that most clippings are maximally short. So the one-syllable clippings are the most frequent category. Prof is one example. And that's the most frequent case. And after that, there is a relatively rapid decline as clippings get longer. So there's a sizable group of two-syllable clippings, like exam. And there are some clippings with 3 syllables, neolib, and even 4, paramedic. But after that, you can see that it's practically examples that you can count on one hand. This aligns with earlier observations of studies that have examined large collections of authentic clippings. So far, that's not a big surprise. This graph here shows you how speakers create clippings. So what are the parts that are typically missing? Again, there's a clear tendency. So about 80% of the data represent the simple case of what's called back clipping in the literature. So the final part of the word is missing, as in prof from professor. After that, we have front clippings, like alligator, which gives us gator. And after that, a few other categories, which I summarized here in terms of middle clippings, middle and end clippings, and then just a category other. Let me say a few words about them. So middle clippings, like nugs from nuggets, they're typically grammatical plurals, like shorts or stats or nugs. And you might argue that this is really end clipping with a plural s. Yeah? But for the moment, let's keep middle clipping as its own category. Middle and end clipping here is common with compounds. So in some way, clippings like rom-com from romantic comedy, they behave like compounds. They have the stress on the initial element, so it's rom-com and not rom-com. Yeah. And finally, we have a category other that has to accommodate everything that did not fit into any of the first four. So here we have front and end clippings like tech from detective. They exist, but they're kind of rare. Incidentally, when you look at detective, you notice, well, this is a rare category, but it's nonetheless, the example is typical in that what's retained is the stressed syllable. Yeah? It's detective, and so tech is what is kept. Let's look at another way of characterizing our clippings, namely by morphological status. And what we mean by that is whether the remaining portion of a source word is a word, a morpheme, or not even a morpheme. So the latter category, which we call submorphemic, that is actually the most frequent category. So that's exemplified by prof. Prof is not a morpheme, yeah. So that instantiates this submorphemic category. Some clippings can be analyzed as forms that would otherwise be considered bound morphemes. So sub in subordinate. Sub is actually a prefix that occurs in other words. Submarine, substandard, yeah, so there are these other words. And so we categorize this here as morphemic. And then finally, we have clippings that originate from compound words and that are formally identical to independent words. So for example, step from stepsister. Right. Now, previous research on clippings has yielded the insights that segmental and suprasegmental phonological factors have a very large influence on clipping. And so we, of course, wanted to control for these factors. With regard to segmental phonology, the kinds of sounds that appear in the clippings, we divided our clippings into three categories that capture different types of ending. We distinguish clippings that end in a consonant cluster, such as merch, yeah? And then we have clippings that end in a simple consonant, such as prof. And when we have clippings that end in a vowel, such as demo. And what you see in the graph is that consonant endings are the most frequent ones. And if we add up clusters and consonants together, it seems like about 75% of our clippings end in at least one consonant. And that in turn means that there's a large preference for closed syllables or even heavy syllables. And that makes sense, given that these syllables are short, but very recognizable. Yeah? So the length to signal ratio is very favorable. There's a lot of material that lets you identify the source word. So this tendency is fully in line with Arndt Lappe's criterion of recoverability. Closed syllables are better with regard to recoverability than open syllables. Clippings need to be informative enough so that you can recover the source word. So that's why we see this large ratio of closed syllables here. Moving on to suprasegmental phonology, we distinguish clippings with initial stress, such as demo, from clippings with non-initial stress, such as demob. Yeah, so in demob, that's from demobilization. There, the stress is on the second syllable, and it's easy to see that non-initial stress is really an exception. Yeah. Now, of course, most clippings just have one syllable, and so those, by necessity, are stress initial. So what would be interesting is to check whether this distribution of initial and non-initial stress is really the same across clippings of different lengths, or if these factors somehow interact. I will return to this in just a few minutes. Still on the topic of stress, we noted for each clipping in our database whether or not it preserves the main stress of the source word. So as you can see here, the chances are really somewhat 50-50. Yeah, so a clipped word will either change the main stress, as in admin from administration. Yeah, so in administration, the stress is in the penultimate, and in admin, it's actually on the initial syllable. Yeah, so the stress pattern is different. But we also have 50% of our database where the stress is just maintained, as in dino from dinosaur. Now, as I said, we'll come back to the sounds of clipping in just a few minutes. For now, let's move on to the parts of speech. And here we have this kind of distribution. Previous studies of English clippings have noted a very strong noun bias. And this is fully confirmed by our data. So nouns are by far the most frequent lexical class. And well, again, that's illustrated by prof here. And this tendency becomes even stronger if we add clippings that potentially illustrate several categories. So for example, the clipping co-ed can be either nominal, it can be a noun, or it can be an adjective. So we might add it to the nominal category. And then detox here can be either a noun or a verb. Yeah, you can detox can be a thing. It can also be something you do. Other parts of speech do exist. Yeah, so we have adjectives like brill from brilliant, verbs like fess from confess, interjections like G, yeah, that is comes from Jesus, probably, prob, yeah, but you see that these are relatively marginal categories. The music is playing here with the nouns and the ambicategorical categories. Now, one more graph before we move on. And this graph captures a distinction that David, Jennifer, and I have discussed quite a bit. So the issue at hand here is whether the source word is a simple lexical item or whether it is a compound. So a clipping such as high res derives from high resolution, yeah? Not as a phrase, but as a compound. As you can see, compounds account for a sizable chunk of our clippings. And we hypothesize that the kind of clipping pattern that you see in high res might be especially common with these elements. Right, now you have a good first impression of what is in our database. So let me briefly recapitulate what I've been going over so far. So I've presented to you 8 variables that we have annotated in the clipping database. These variables capture segmental and suprasegmental phonological characteristics. They capture aspects of morphology, and they capture information on word classes. And as such, they allow us to characterize our clippings in very precise terms. Yeah? So we have the number of syllables, the clipped part at the end, the front, the middle. We have the morphological status. Is the clipping a submorphemic unit? Is it a morpheme? Is it a word? Is the final sound a consonant, a cluster, or a vowel? We have information on the stress pattern, stress preservation, the lexical class, and the question of whether the source word is or isn't a compound. Now that's already a lot, yeah, but we've actually included further variables that I won't discuss here, yeah, so don't worry. But I just want you to know that they are there and that we will analyze them in future work. So these include variables that, for example, capture whether or not there is a sound difference between the clipping and the source word. So for example, in bro, which differs with regard to its vowel quality from brother. We also did some work on the semantics of the clippings. So we characterized all the clippings in terms of their semantic domain. There are quite a few clippings from science, like lab. There are animal clippings. Like lab can not only mean laboratory, but it can also mean a Labrador dog breed. Yeah. There are clippings with regard to drug use, music, gaming, programming, really lots and lots of different semantic domains. And then we have a whole range of variables that reflect corpus-based frequency measures, such as the normalized frequency of the form of the clipping, the neighborhood density of the clipping, dispersion of the clipping, and the number of word types that contain the clipping as a substring. So for example, with regard to this last variable here, the clipping prof appears not only in professor, but also in professional, profound, and so on and so forth. So we reason that this might actually have an effect on how similar looking words are clipped. I'll be happy to answer questions about these variables, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'd like to focus on the first 8 that I presented to you earlier. Now, with all that in mind, let's see what we can actually learn from all of that data. Yeah? Earlier quantitative studies of clipping have adopted techniques such as logistic regression, which is a technique that allows you to analyze how speakers decide between 2 alternative strategies, for example, end clipping versus front clipping. And regression techniques can identify the underlying factors that bias speakers either towards one strategy or towards the other. And our approach here is a little different. Yeah, we'll adopt a statistical tool that is called Configural Frequency Analysis. And in the next minutes, I'd like to explain how this technique works and what results we can obtain if we use it. So essentially, the approach relies on the cross-tabulation of variables, which allows you to check whether or not 2 variables are mutually independent. Let's take an example to make this more concrete. So one variable that I talked about is the length of our clippings. So does a clipping have 1 syllable? Does it have 2 syllables, 3 syllables, or even more? And another variable that I mentioned is the retention of stress. Is the clipping stressed in the same way as its source word, or is there a difference? Now, when we put these 2 together, we can ask whether the length of the clipping influences whether or not it retains the stress of the source word. So expressed differently, when we compare clippings that are 1, 2, 3, or 4 syllables long, is the rate of stress retention always the same, or is there a difference? Yeah. Let me show you some data to illustrate this question. So in this table, you see the observed frequencies of how often stress is retained or not retained in clippings of different lengths. For example, our database contains 731 clippings that have 1 syllable and that retain the stress of the source word. Now, the numbers in brackets, they indicate the expected frequencies. So you see that based on the overall number of 1 syllable clippings and the overall number of clippings in which stress is retained, we would actually just expect 625 clippings, well, 624 and change. And this means that there are more 1 syllable clippings with stress retained than we would expect. Yeah? In other words, this cell of the table is overpopulated, And there are, in fact, other cells in this table that are also overrepresented in our database. So everything that's marked up in red on this slide here is overrepresented. It happens more often than we would expect by chance. And the cool thing that you see here is that we have a clean split. Yeah? On the one hand, there are one-syllable clippings where the stress is retained. So they have a tendency to retain the stress from the source word. And then on the other side of the table, we have multi-syllable clippings. Yeah? So 2, 3, and 4 syllables, which have a greater probability of changing the stress pattern. Yeah? So all of these occur more often than expected. This is not only curious, if you like, it also corresponds to the tendency of clipping to facilitate recoverability. Yeah? You remember recoverability, short clippings have a greater need to retain stress because they have relatively little material that ensures recoverability. By contrast, longer clippings are easy to recognize even when the stress pattern is changed, yeah? Because the segmental phonological cues are stronger. So you remember the example that I gave you earlier, admin from administration. Yeah. So there we have at least 2 syllables to let us recover the source word, administration. And so on the basis of those 2 syllables, we can get the job done. So it doesn't have to be that the stress is actually maintained. Right. Now, this cross-tabulation of 2 variables gives us a first insight into how clippings work in our database, but there are a few more things that I would like to explore here. So let me take another example of 2 variables that interact. The first variable is the type of clipping that we observe, that is the difference between end clipping, front clipping, middle clipping, and so on. And the second syllable is the morphological status of the clipping. So that can be a morpheme, it can be a submorphemic unit, it can be a word. So putting those 2 together, we can ask whether end clipping and front clipping yield clippings that differ in their morphological status. So is perhaps end clipping more likely to produce clippings that correspond to a morpheme rather than a submorphemic unit? Again, let me make this more concrete. This slide shows you a cross-tabulation of the 2 variables. So by comparing the observed frequencies against the expected frequencies in the brackets, we can identify overpopulated cells and underpopulated cells. And in this case, this reveals, for example, that end clippings have a greater than chance tendency to be morphemic. For example, if you're doing paleo, that means you're doing a paleo diet. I'm actually not quite sure what you eat on such a diet. It sounds like there might be barbecue on the menu, which is always nice. But that is what's happening here. And you see that morphemic end clippings, we have, well, about 45 more examples in our database than what would be expected by chance. If we go down to front clipping, we see that one category here is hugely overrepresented, namely words. So front clippings yield words much more often than we would expect. And this is often the case, for example, for compounds that are clipped so that the modifier is clipped off. So instead of going to the nightclub, you say that I'm going to the club. Okay. And again, this is fully in line with recoverability, since the head of a compound, club in this case, signifies the kind of thing that the compound refers to. So it's easy to figure out what the short word refers to. And then finally, I'd like to draw your attention to middle and end clipping. Middle and end clipping almost exclusively yields submorphemic clippings. And you see we have 91 examples here and just 2 and 1 in the other 2 categories. And these 91 are, well, about 1/3 more than what we would actually expect. And One example for this is the one that you've seen already, rom-com from romantic comedy. If you're looking at the three examples on this slide, you'll see that all three of them are in fact compounds. Yeah? So rom-com, polyodide, nightclub. And depending on the part of the word that is clipped off, the morphemic status of the clipping is different. And you might be curious, if we cross-tabulate these variables, but we do it once for compounds only, and another time for source words that are simplex words, will that yield a different picture? Yeah? And this is essentially what a configural frequency analysis allows you to do. It lets you cross-tabulate not only two variables, but instead 3 or 4 or even more variables in order to see if the observed frequencies differ significantly from the expected frequencies. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, let me show you one more thing that illustrates why it matters. So we've seen how end clipping and front clipping differ with regard to morphology, but of course the same variable also differs with regard to sound. So we can ask whether end clipping and front clipping yield clippings that differ with regard to their segmental phonology, so with regard to their final phonological segment. So is it, for example, the case that end clippings are more likely to end in a vowel? Yeah. So here's, by now you're familiar with this kind of table here. So if we, again, inspect the cells in this table and check observed and expected frequencies, we see that there are a number of interesting tendencies. So middle clippings, they have a tendency to end in a consonant cluster because of forms such as shorts, stats, gents, nugs, yeah? And you recognize these as plural forms that are technically end clipped but retain the plural S. Then we have front clipped words, which have a higher than chance probability of ending in a consonant. So two examples there would be quake from earthquake and shroom from mushroom. And well, no surprise, this is in line with recoverability. If you take away the front of a clipping, that makes it hard to recover the source word. So the least you can do as a speaker is to make sure that there's a final consonant to facilitate the hearer's job of recovering the source. Finally, end clippings with final vowels are overrepresented. So forms such as dino or limo, dino from dinosaur, limo from limousine, they appear more often than would be expected. Right. With all that in mind, let me get to the configural frequency analysis. So the input to the analysis is our clipping database, and especially the annotations for the variables that I showed to you earlier. The number of syllables, the clipped part, the morphological status, the final sound, the stress pattern, stress preservation, and whether or not the source word is a compound. All of these variables are cross-tabulated with each other, and this goes beyond the bivariate cross tables that you've seen on the previous slide. So the analysis creates a table that combines all 7 variables and their levels, so the yes and no of the source word compound and the yes and no of stress preservation, and so on and so forth. And the goal of frequency analysis is to use that table to find configurations of features that appear more often than would be expected. So at its basis, the technique is just a simple comparison of observed frequencies and expected frequencies. And in addition, the analysis gives us some significance values. So it uses the chi-square test of independence to test whether any asymmetries in the data are statistically significant. So the analysis performs multiple chi-square tests on cross tables, and it uses a Bonferroni correction in order to adjust the required probability of error downward. So the level of the required p-values is set to very, very low, and only if the test returns an even lower p-value is that result counted as significant. I'll be happy to say more about the technical details of that, but the most important thing is that it's really just a comparison of observed frequencies and expected frequencies, which is straightforward enough. Now, let me make this more concrete. Let's suppose that we have a clipping that has one syllable that is an instance of end clipping that has the morphological status of a submorphemic unit. It ends in a consonant, it has initial stress, and it preserves the stress from the source word, and it's derived from a source word that is not a compound. Yeah? An example for this kind of clipping would be croc, from crocodile. And the question for the configural frequency analysis would be, are forms like croc overrepresented in our database, or do we see them less often than we would theoretically expect? Yeah, that is the question. And this we can simply check, yeah, with the data that we have. And the answer is that this configuration is observed much more often than we would expect. This means this is what we call a type. That's a technical term in configural frequency analysis. So we observe 359 clippings like croc, but we would expect only to find 139. So the configural frequency analysis tells us this is a highly significant asymmetry. The overall output of the configural frequency analysis gives us a list of such types of configurations that are significantly overrepresented. And it also gives us a list of so-called anti-types. So those would be configurations that we expect to see, but that are conspicuously absent from the data. Now, if you allow, I would like you to see some results, and I'd like to show you 3 more types and then an anti-type. Right. Let me start here. One of the most striking clipping types is exemplified by clippings such as poly or extra, hydro, mono, macro, auto, or bio. And you see the structural characteristics. Yeah, we have 2 syllables. These are all end clippings. Yeah, and the form represents a morpheme. Quite often it's a classical Greek or Latin morpheme like poly or extra, yeah. And it ends in a vowel, yeah, all of them. It has initial stress, and it does not retain the stress of the source word. So bio has a different stress than geography, yeah. And finally, the source word is not a compound. We have more than 100 of these forms in our database, and by comparison, we would expect only 9, yeah, that have this precise profile. So this, again, is a highly significant asymmetry in the data. Here's another type, which has 2 syllables, end clipping. It has submorphemic status. It ends in a consonant, has non-initial stress. It preserves the stress from the source word, and it's not based on a compound source word. And this is the type that David, Jennifer, and I call the delish type. So, well, delish from delicious, profesh from professional, posish from position, compash from compassion, and depresh from depression. You might recognize these, you might not. So I think this is a fairly recent pattern. And we find 31 such forms, and that outperforms our expectations, our expect, you might say. Okay. Now, I know that I'm presenting quite a lot of data here, but that's also kind of the idea. Now, I need to show you this configuration here that we call the rom-com type. We have 2 syllables. This is middle and end clipping. The morphological status is submorphemic. We have a final consonant, initial stress, no stress preservation, but here we have finally a compound source word. So that's not only rom-com, that's also sitcom from situation comedy. Sitrep is a situation report. Mil-spec are military specifications. MinTech is the Ministry of Technology. And you see that overall, this type isn't all that frequent. We only have 11 such words in the database. But nonetheless, this configuration appears much more often than expected. So this asymmetry is really telling. And this is a feature of configural frequency analysis. It can draw your attention to patterns that you wouldn't really notice if you look just at the most frequent features. Yeah? It can tell you that there's an asymmetry and there is an interesting pattern, even if it is a relatively small pattern, yeah? A minor pattern. Okay, before I wrap up here, let me show you one antitype, one configuration that we would expect to see, but which is relatively absent from our data. And this would be the antitype that is illustrated by words such as rehab. So rehab has 2 syllables. It instantiates end clipping. Rehab as such is not a morpheme, it's submorphemic. It ends in a consonant. It has initial stress. It doesn't preserve the stress from the source word, and it doesn't come from a compound. We do find several clippings of in English. So besides rehab, there is Intel, admin, improv, and a couple of others. However, we don't find them as often as we would expect. Yeah. So this brings me back to one of the examples that we talked about earlier, namely Reno and Renov. Yeah. And if memory serves, you had a preference for Renov. Yeah. Now, I can now tell you that Renov, it exists, but in our database, it actually instantiates an antitype, a configuration that appears less often than expected. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that Renov doesn't work. It just means that if you've picked Renov, then it's probably because you know other clippings that sound just like Renov, like, for example, improv. Yeah? So there are not only these general types, there's also analogy, which is there as the basis for clipping formation. Now, you didn't like Reno, but what about Reno in our database? Reno is kind of like the hydro type that I showed you earlier, except its morphological status is not morphemic, yeah, but instead submorphemic. So hydro and poly and extra, those are morphemes, but Reno actually is not morphemic but submorphemic. All the other features are the same. And let me switch back and forth. 2 syllables, end clipping, vowel, initial, no, no. That is exactly the same configuration here. The only difference is that Reno is submorphemic. This configuration occurs about twice as often as expected. Yeah. So it's also illustrated by forms such as condo, docu, ammo, deli, indie, and so on and so forth. All of these are well-known English clippings. So this might play a role, yeah, when speakers choose a clipping such as Reno from Renov. As I said, you can pick Renov as the basis, on the basis of analogy. So that is a perfectly valid way of clipping renovation. Anyway, I'd like to come to a close here. I hope to have illustrated that clipping is not as chaotic and unprincipled as it has sometimes been described. There are some findings that are robust and that resonate with claims that have been made in earlier work, for example, by Thomas Berg and Sabine Arndt-Lappe. And coming back to the question that I had in the title of this talk, what can we actually learn from 2,400 English clippings? Well, our findings corroborate earlier results. such as the noun bias of English clippings, the predominance of end clippings, the fact that front and end clipping have different prosodic and morphological characteristics, or that clippings are optimized for recoverability. But we also have some new insights. So, for example, that clippings from compounds differ from simplex clippings, that clippings of different lengths differ in their segmental and suprasegmental characteristics. And most importantly, that there is not one single clipping schema, but that there are instead different clipping types, different patterns, like the croc type, the hydro type, the delish type, rom-com, and in fact others that I didn't get to show you. Right, all of that of course is nice, but there's still work ahead of us. So we still have quite a long to-do list in the clipping project. We still want to analyze quantitative corpus-based variables. So what about frequency? What about dispersion? So the way a clipping form is distributed across corpora. We still want to carry out psycholinguistic experiments that systematically test the psychological reality of types and antitypes. So when we ask people to choose between Reno and Brenoff, do they reliably choose one element over the other? And we want to explore the semantics of clippings. So is familiarity really all there is, or is there something more to say about the semantics of clippings? And ultimately, I would also like to model clipping patterns as a network of constructions. So we'll approach this topic from a constructional perspective, and we'll try to understand clippings as a construction family, different generalizations that you see there. And finally, we want to branch out to other languages. So Jennifer has been working on compiling a database of French clippings, and there we're almost ready to analyze the data. And of course, our end game is to make comparisons between English and French, because English and French have quite different phonological characteristics. So one thing that we want to see is whether the two languages behave really different with regard to those variables. Right, so you see that there's a lot more that we still need to do, and I'd be more than happy to talk about that at some later point. But for now, I would like to thank you for your time and your attention. And yeah, I want to express my gratitude to G for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. And just to end here, I can't finish without thanking David and Jennifer, my amazing research team members. And with that, I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for the insightful talk, and also introducing us to the new technique that really useful for exploring the topic. So, well, we have several questions that I would like to show you. Maybe it's the bird inside the chat, so I will share some screen here. Okay.
Okay, I should stop sharing my screen now.
Okay. Okay, so far we have 3 questions. So the first one is from Professor Putrajaya. So
yeah. Okay. New connects definitely. I want to say that there are in our database, and X actually is like a lab, a clipping with several meanings. Yeah. So some of the clippings in our database have more than 10 meanings actually. So for example, sub can have all of these meanings. How do we decide as hearers what meaning a clipping has? Well, quite often the context is so rich that there is no risk of misunderstanding. Yeah? So if 2 dog owners meet each other and talk about a lab, then it's totally clear that what they're talking about is a Labrador dog and not the chemistry lab that maybe one of the speakers is working in. So yeah, there's not a big risk with regard to that. And I would hypothesize also that speakers only use clippings if they are sure to be understood. Okay, so I mean, there's always a slight risk that you can take, but most of the time, the situation where you are likely to use a clipping is when you are among people that you know well, or people where you can be fairly sure that they know what you're talking about, and so there's not much of a risk of miscommunication.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So now we have the second question here from Dr. Nyaman.
Yes, banana. Nana we have in the database that I know, so by our logic, we counted it as a clipping. Yeah. Now the fact, of course, the clip of child speech persist in adult usage. So what we're modeling, really, what we're trying to figure out is how adult speakers shorten words and use them in everyday communication. So arguably that's a phenomenon that is somewhat different from the L1 acquisition data, where children produce words that are shortened, but that are also phonologically adjusted. So, for example, if there's consonant harmony or, fronting of consonants, or whether there are other phonological things going on. But sometimes these two coincide. So Nana is maybe something that children say, but it is a word that has made its way into adult usage in some way or form as well. And so it ended up in our database.
Okay. So now this one.
Yeah. So that's the million-dollar question, right? What factors are the most important ones that we see in the clipping process? So I cannot pretend that our data so far have shown us the most important underlying factors. Yeah. So what we've analyzed so far is how these different structural variables play out in the clipping process. Now, many of these are broadly in line with factors such as recoverability, and also with the principle of least effort. There are other principles that probably play a role that I didn't talk about. For example, what Martin Hasselblad has called the maximum of extravagance. Yeah. So why should people ever do something that is somehow out of the norm? Yeah? If there's already a perfectly good word for me to use, why should I go and shorten it? It's not only because I'm lazy. Yeah. So the principle of least effort partly explains this, but there are other ways of being lazy. I might reduce the vowels a little bit. I might reduce the consonants as such, but clipping is arguably more than that. It also sends a social signal. Yeah, and this is quite in line with what Martin Hasselblad has described under this maximum of extravagance. You talk in such a way that you are noticed, and you talk in such a way that you form a bond with your interlocutor. So I think their clipping is really, really important. So if I use a clipping for a relatively specialized word, I can signal to my interlocutor that we share a special bond, maybe a special kind of expertise. Yeah. Let me give you just one example. There is a type of electric guitar that is called a Stratocaster. And guitar players talk about this kind of guitar model, and they have a clipping for it. It's called a Strat. So if I am in a conversation and I use that term, yeah. So maybe I tell my friend, yeah, you know, for that part, it would be really nice if you could use a Strat to get that glassy tone. Then I automatically signal that, you know, I know what I'm talking about, and I know that you know this too. We share a certain expertise, and that can be a very strong motivation for using a clipping rather than the strong word. So do I know whether extravagance or the principle of least effort is more important? I don't know that on the basis of my data so far, yeah, but I have a hypothesis that tells me, well, here laziness is really not the crucial factor. It's this social motivation of extravagance. But that really remains to be shown empirically, and that's where our experiments come in. So we hope to run experiments that address precisely this question of which factors are more important than others, because in the experiments we can manipulate these factors. Yeah, so in an imperfect way, perhaps. Yeah, but we can try to control for things like social distance between speakers, or the amount of effort, or the risk of communicative failure, and things like that.
Okay. So, Prof. Harke, Pak Wayan, do you want to say something for that? Oh no. Okay. So we still have 10 more minutes, I think, if anyone wants to.
No, thank you. Really, it's you know, thanks, Martin. I enjoyed your talk. It's really nice, and you know, learned something. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So we still have 10 more minutes if anyone wants to ask directly to Martin. And I also need to say that maybe most of us still new towards observed and expected frequency because quantitative method is not really something that is taught to us, at least from my experience before as undergraduate and a master student. So maybe from the participant here, I would suggest to check Martin's YouTube channel on Corpus Linguistics playlist, where he also explained that kind of thing, observed and expected frequency in Corpus Linguistics, that may be useful for us in our study. So yeah, maybe other question. Oh, go ahead, Martin. Go ahead. I will get this question back to the slides. Go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, if there are any questions that you think of later today, do feel free to write me an email. Yeah, and I'm here, so I'm happy to answer your questions. Yeah, so the methodological thing, actually, we're not, the methodology itself isn't all that new. That is something that we apply maybe to a phenomenon that hasn't been analyzed in this way up to this point. So, okay, that's probably fair to say that is somewhat original. But really, the main aim of the project is to describe the systematicity in a process that up to this point has been viewed as more or less unsystematic or even trivial. Yeah. So the thing about clipping is that everybody knows what it is, and it comes up in just about any linguistics intro class. Yeah. But then that's just about where our knowledge stops for now. So that's not entirely fair. Yeah? So that there is research out there, some of which I talked about, but really finding out how the clipping process works and whether it is one generalization or several interacting generalizations, that is the end game of what we want to do in this project. So essentially what we want to end up with is a predictive model of the kind that Sabine Antlappe was she was calling on. So we would like to build a computational model that you can use to take a long word and derive a prediction as to how actual speakers will shorten that word. Yeah, so with input and output. So given this kind of input, what output do we expect and with what probabilities? So the model does not only give us one output, but rather it gives us a range of different outputs with probabilities that are attached to them. Yeah, so that means in some cases, the model will say, here, I'm 90% sure that people will do this, but we might also have 5% who go for this and 5% who go for this. And then there might be other cases, other words, where the model tells us, look, here it can be a 50-50 split. Either you do this or you do that. We want to come up with that model, and we want to test it against the behavior of real speakers. So if we give the word to, let's say, a group of 100 participants in an experiment, we want to see a profile of responses that is more or less in line with what the computer does.
Ibu Poppy, do you want to say something? And there is one question I think that have you addressed it? Can you think of other research hypotheses we can have using CFA based on multivariable factors?
Yeah, so this configural frequency analysis is appropriate for research questions that basically, well, would address differences between groups or differences between different categories. And the only thing that makes it different from, let's say, a standard chi-square test is that you can include further variables. So, the questions that you can answer with a simple chi-square test are questions like, for example, do men and women differ significantly with regard to a specific behavior? Yeah? So if we do a count here, we ask all women and all men, are they left-handed or right-handed? Yeah? Stupid experiment. Yeah, but if there were a significant difference, then the chi-square test would tell us that. All the configural frequency analysis does is that allows us to take in further variables and analyze, for example, if so we have gender and we have handedness and we have a third variable, such as, for example, are you vegetarian or not? Yeah, so that would then show whether there's some kind of three-way interaction going on between those variables.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So I think we still have 3 more minutes, and it appears that no one can ask questions. So, and also we don't want to go over for your time. So I think, yeah, I think this is the end. So I would like personally thank you, and also on behalf of our institution here, to thank you for your time. It's early in the morning in Switzerland. And
it's 9:30.
Yeah. Okay, so as Martin have said, so please do email him if you have question. He will reply the email, I'm sure. And yeah, there are more stuff on his YouTube channel on construction grammar, corpus linguistics, and also cognitive linguistics if you want to go further from this. So yeah, first and next, I would like to thank also the participant who attended this session. So I think that's it. Thank you very much and have a good day, everyone. Thank you, Martin. Stay safe there and see you sometime. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks to all of you. Really enjoyed being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice presentation, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you.